If you like what you see, go ahead and subscribe to see more of our content. And also make sure to ring the bell if you actually want to see our content. Thanks, YouTube. If you really like what you see, you should know that we did this all with a budget of blood, sweat, and tears. So many tears. Just imagine what we can do with an actual budget. Become a patron of ours to find out. You'll gain access to videos up to a day early, alongside other perks. Thanks as always to our rare tier patrons Morello, Chriselle, Nullstring, and Andrew, alongside all of our other patrons. Also, we have a TCG player affiliate link, and you should definitely start with it whenever you make a purchase there. Doing so will let you support the channel at no additional cost to yourself. Finally, we've been really trying to keep an eye on social media better, so as always, you can find the links to those accounts down in the description. Alright, that's enough self-promotion. Let's go ahead and get into the video. Hey everyone, it's Matt here, and welcome back to another TheCommanderGuys gameplay video. So I know there's a lot of buzz in the community right now about a certain product that Wizards is producing. Just know that we're keeping an eye on it, and we'll address it when we think the time is right. But let's not get too caught up in the drama, and go ahead and jump into player introductions. First off this week, we have Josh, playing Kels Fight Fixer. Kels is a Dimir Aristocrats deck, which is looking to win with any number of various sacrifice-oriented combos. Josh kept Living Death, Muldrifter, Liliana Standard Bearers, Zulaport Cutthroat, Ancient Tomb, and a pair of snow-covered islands. Then comes Daniel, playing Yarok the Desecrated. Yarok is focused around doubling the effects of value-oriented ETBs, all to ramp into more powerful ETBs to close out the game. Daniel kept Soul of the Harvest, Fibblethip the Lost, Skyshroud Claim, Reanimate, Omen of the Hunt, Temple of Mystery, and a Swamp. Up next is Zack, playing Grenzo Dungeon Warden. Grenzo's a unique take on a combo deck, which focuses on cheating various combo pieces into play from the bottom of Zack's library. And Zack kept Viscera Seer, Taurine Mauler, Greymerge Devasfidel, and both a pair of mountains and a pair of swamps. Last but certainly not least, we have Michael partnering up with Tymna and Kydele. Michael's deck is an experimental take on a control shell, which is looking to grind out card advantage so he can eventually open the way to finish off with a combo. Michael kept Toxic Deluge, Abrupt Decay, Heroic Intervention, Earthcraft, Scalding Tarn, Godless Shrine, and a Forest. Josh starts us off. He drops an island and passes off. Daniel drops a Temple of Mystery and decides he likes the card he has on top before passing as well. Zack drops a Swamp and uses it to cast a Viscera Seer. And then Michael drops a Scalding Tarn to close out round 1. Josh drops an Ancient Tomb and then decides to shock himself to evoke a Muldrifter. He sacrifices the Drifter as it enters and then draws 2 cards before passing off. Daniel drops a Swamp. He casts Fibblethip the Lost and draws a card as it enters, before passing off as well. Zack drops a Mountain and casts his commander Grenzo, and in response, Michael cracks Scalding Tarn to bring in a Zagoth Triome, and after that, Zack passes off. Finally, Michael drops a Wooded Foothills to close out round 2. Josh drops another island. He shocks himself to cast a Sad Robot, and goes to search for a basic. Michael decides to crack his Foothills to cut down on time, and Josh brings in a tapped Swamp, before Michael brings in an Indatha Triome, and with that, Josh passes off. Daniel drops a Jungle Hollow and gains a life as it enters. He then moves to combat and hits Michael with Fibblethip, before passing turn. Zack drops a Swamp. He cast Krenko Tin Street Kingpin before moving to combat and hitting Michael as well. Michael then decides not to hit himself, and brings in Godless Shrine tapped, before passing off once again. Josh casts a Mystic Remora. He then shocks himself once again to cast a Vindictive Vampire, and then passes off. Daniel drops a Flooded Grove. He casts a Sky Shroud Claim, and Josh draws from Mystic Remora on that cast. Daniel then goes to bring in a pair of Forests untapped, before passing off. Zack drops a Mountain, and then goes to move to combat, and before he does so, Michael abrupt decays Krenko, which gives Josh a draw from Mystic Remora in the process. Krenko's then destroyed, and Zack casts a Taurine Mauler in main 2, before passing off. Michael drops a Forest. He casts a Grand Abolisher, and Zack adds a counter to the Mauler as Michael passes off as well. Josh decides to pay for Mystic Remora on his upkeep. He moves to combat and swings Solemn at Zack, who blocks with the Mauler. Josh draws a card as Solemn dies, and also gains a life and pings his opponents for 1 thanks to Vindictive Vampire. And then in main 2, Josh drops an island, before shocking himself to cast a Master Transmuter. And as the Mauler gets another +1/+1 counter, Josh passes turn. Daniel casts his commander Yarok, and Zack adds another counter to the Mauler. Daniel then reanimates Josh's Solemn Simulacrum, which triggers both the Mauler and also Josh's Mystic Remora. Reanimate then resolves, and Daniel loses 4 life, before doubling Solemn's trigger with Yarok, and going to grab both a swamp and an island tapped. And with that, Daniel passes off. Zack drops a swamp. He casts Virtus the Veiled, and adds a counter to Taurine Mauler. And as Virtus enters, Zack targets Daniel with Virtus's partner with trigger. Daniel searches his library and fails to find Gorm the Great as Zack passes off. And unfortunately, Michael misses a land drop and immediately passes off. Josh sacrifices Mystic Remora on his upkeep. He bounces Master Transmuter back to hand to cheat in a Chromatic Orrery, and immediately uses its 5 mana to cast a Living Death. Zack adds a counter to the Mauler, and then sacrifices his board to Viscera in response to Living Death. As priority passes on Living Death again, Michael casts an Assassin's Trophy to destroy Chromatic Orrery. The Orrery is destroyed, and Josh goes to grab an untapped swamp to the field. Living Death finally resolves, and does its thing, as Josh draws 2 from Mole Drifter entering. He manages to draw a swamp to play for turn, and then shocks himself to cast a Soul Ring. He follows up with an Arcane Signet, and then a Grim Tutor. And after tutoring, he casts a Pitiless Plunderer, and then passes off. Daniel drops an untapped Sunken Hollow. He casts a Soul of the Harvest, and follows it up with a Fierce Empath. He draws a card from Soul of the Harvest on that ETB, and then goes to tutor up an Avenger of Zendikar to hand. And then at Daniel's end step, Zack activates Grenzo, revealing a swamp from the bottom of his library and putting it into his graveyard. Zack then drops a Graven Cairns for turn. He casts a Twilight Prophet and descends on that cast. He then moves to combat and swings the Mauler at Daniel, while also swinging Krenko at Josh. Krenko gets a +1/+1 counter on that attack and creates 2 1/1 goblins. And as blockers are declared, Michael shortcuts again by casting an Enlightened Tutor. Michael goes to search his library, and damage happens, as Josh pings each of his opponents with the Cutthroat, while also creating a treasure from the Plunderer. And finally, Michael finds a Soul Ring with E-Tutor as Zack passes off. On his turn, Michael casts his Soul Ring, before paying 11 life into Toxic Deluge. The Deluge then resolves and wipes the board, and Josh creates a treasure and pings each of his opponents, from the Plunderer and Cutthroat respectively. And with all of the immediate threats dealt with right now, Michael passes off. Josh shocks himself to cast a Mere Retriever. He casts his commander Kels, and follows up with a Lim-Dwal's Vault. When it's all said and done, Josh pays a total of 8 life to look at the top 45 cards of his library 5 cards at a time. He rearranges the last pile of 5 cards he looked at, before shuffling the rest of his library and putting those cards on top. Josh then sacrifices Mere Retriever to activate Kels, while also paying a mana into Kels' trigger to draw a card. Josh then resolves the Retriever's death trigger and returns Chromatic Orrery to hand. He follows up by casting a Songs of the Damned, and adds a total of 6 mana, which he then uses to cast Chromatic Orrery. Next comes a Dark Petition with Spell Mastery, and Josh goes to tutor up a card, as Michael both tracks the 3 mana Josh adds, and rearranges Josh's board a bit. Finally, Josh casts an Ashnod's Altar, and passes off to Daniel. Daniel casts a Simic Signet. He follows up with a Destiny Spinner, and then casts a Panharmonicon. And with that out of the way, he casts a Yarok's Fenlurker. The Fenlurker's ETB is doubled next to Panharmonicon, and each of Daniel's opponents exiles these 2 cards from their respective hands. And with that, Daniel passes off. Zack recasts his Commander Grenzo, and then passes turn. Michael casts his Commander Tymna. He follows up with an Earthcraft, and then passes off again. Josh shocks himself to cast a Falconwrath Noble, and in response, Zack activates Grenzo again, and manages to cheat in a Triskelion of all things. When Zack regains priority on the Noble, he pings down Kels with Triskelion, but this doesn't honestly matter that much to Josh, who just recasts Kels. Josh then casts the Nadir Kraken, and at this point he wins the game since there's no interaction at the table. Here's how. Josh sacrifices Falconwrath Noble to Ashnod's Altar to generate 2 colorless mana. This triggers Kels, and Josh pays one of his 2 floating colorless to draw a card thanks to the effect of Chromatic Orrery. That draw triggers Nadir Kraken, and Josh pays in his other floating colorless to get a Tentacle token. From there, Josh is able to sacrifice the Tentacle to restart this loop. Josh does get lucky though, as he top decks a Mana Crypt, which gives him just enough mana to Dark Ritual into the Sir Conrad he has in hand, and with an Aristocrat on board, a combo which relies on sacrificing creatures to draw cards, and more than enough cards left in his library. Josh pings down his opponents, and ultimately walks away with a win.